On this topic, her most recent publications include Muslim Female Religious Authority in Russia, How Mukhlisa Bibi became the first female Qadi in the modern Muslim world, and From Kolkhoz to Pulpit, Rashida Ishaqi and Female Religious Authority in Soviet and post-Soviet Russia. Dr. Garipova is also part of the collaborative project on sacred geography of Kazakhstan and explores Tatar mosques in and around the city of Semipalatinsk in northeastern Kazakhstan. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Almira. Would you like to share this screen, Rozaliya?
Yes.
Great.
Just a moment.
Is it? Oh, good. Okay.
Okay. Here you go. Thanks for the general for your introduction, and thanks for inviting me to participate in this event. Yeah, that has been scheduled for actually a year, 1 year earlier, but I'm really glad to present on Rashida Ishaqi and Rashida Abustai today, because tomorrow will be exactly 5 years since she passed away, and I was able to conduct with her the interviews in 2014. So that's approximately 2 years before she passed away. So I feel extremely lucky. I'm actually a historian and historian of Islam. I'm dealing with, I'm working on the communities of Muslim communities of Russia, historically, mostly in the later imperial period. And I haven't actually done research with the contemporary religious authority or anything contemporary. And that was my first research, my first attempt to do this. And I found this question of religious authority, and especially women and religious authority, very fascinating. And her example is very, very interesting. So we can say that she, Rashida Ishaqi, can be considered one of the, or perhaps the most famous, the most prolific Abustai, or the most prolific female religious authority in Russia in the 20th century. So this project is about her, and I've actually completed this article, which turned out to be pretty lengthy, of about 50 pages, and it was accepted in the Journal of Islamic Studies, and we are going over the proofs, so hopefully it will come out very soon. Yeah, so let me show you actually one picture, which is from the news agency. And if you translate the title of it, so this news came out when she passed away on that very day. And when, if you look at the title, we can translate it roughly as she or Rashida stood as at the head of the Muslim elite of post-Soviet Russia. And this basically summarizes what I want to say. Yes, she was a very important figure. And if you look at this, the next slide, I'll just go briefly. The upper photos starting from the left. So this is Abdullah Galiulin, who was the first Mufti of the Republic of Tatarstan from 1992 to 98. And he was her son-in-law. He's still living. He's her son-in-law. The next one, the first Mufti of the Crimea, Sayyid Jalil Ibrahimov, he was the first Mufti. And so this one, he is also her son-in-law. The third figure, Usman Ishaqov, the second Mufti of the Republic of Tatarstan, and the first rector of the Russian Islamic University in the city of Kazan. He's her son. So this figure on the right, he is he is a family relative, not a very close but distant family relative, and he is less connected to her, but still there is an important connection to this personality, and he's the Mufti of Russia and in Siberia. On the lower side are two of her other sons-in-law. One of them is the Muhtasib of the one province in the Tatarstan, probably Bogulma, and the head of one of the important madrasas in the Republic of Tatarstan, and the other one was also Muhtasib of another region of the Republic of Tatarstan. So it's really very interesting that 5 of these people, like one of them is her own son, and 4 of them are her sons-in-law. And it's thrilling to see her connection to these people, not only in terms of not only in terms of the family connection, but in terms of the way she impacted and she shaped their religious authority. So this question, so this topic and this presentation will be about Rashida Ishaqi, and I was trying to understand in this research how this sort of double question, how is it, how can we explain the emergence of her as a religious authority in the post-World War II, and especially in the post-Soviet Russia, and how, what kind of influence did she have on these men? What kind of, how she connected to them in terms, how did she shape their religious authority? So these are the larger questions that I had for this project. And I want to say, I want to start with giving you a better idea about what the term Abastai means. So Abastai refers to a woman who was responsible for the education of women, of girls and women folk in Russia, in Imperial Russia, and so in pre-Soviet Russia, pre-Soviet Russia. So this is a historical institution. This is an institution which has historical roots. And I argued, and you can think about that in Central Asia, there is an equivalent which is referred to as Otin. So Otin is also refers to women who are authoritative, who are knowledgeable, and who usually took care of the education of the girls and women folk. And this is also a historical institution. So this is predominantly among the Uzbek population. For the Tajik population, there is a term which is, you might see the term Bibi Khalifa. So this is also a sort of an equivalent term that is used in other parts of Central Asia. And I argued in this paper that Rashida Ishaqi and the cohort of women who are called Abastais in the post-Soviet period constitute a peculiar case of female religious authority, which emerged in the post-war decades in the Soviet Union. These women, we can say that these women do not actually present a continuation of tradition. They do not constitute a continuation or the revival of traditional female religious figures that existed in pre-Soviet Muslim communities, but they are rather a Soviet phenomenon. And we can understand the emergence only within the Soviet context. So this is what I'm trying to trace. Now, I would like to situate my study by providing you a few theoretical and methodological perspectives. So, I mean, the topic of female religious authority in Islam has been extremely popular in academic research for at least the past 10 to 15 years, and scholars have approached it from a number of different methodological and theoretical perspectives. And for this study, I found two perspectives especially useful to refer to, and I'm trying to use them in the, trying to engage with them in my paper. The first deals with the question of gender, so the first, and especially to the male-female dynamics pertaining to the question of religious authority. So this male-female dynamic has been often seen in opposition to one another. And indeed, when we think about this notion of religious authority, we can see that historically it has been a gendered concept. So in Islam, as well as actually in other religions, historically it was largely, the religious authority was largely held in the hands of male religious elite, the religious scholars, the ulama, madrasa professors, muftis, judges, or qadis, and so on. So when women in the 20th century began to claim religious authority as a result of the processes of religious revival, urbanization, and mass education, they often had to prove their compatibility with men, or struggle with the predominant male religious authority. And the traditional, with the predominant male religious authorities and their traditional presence in such Islamic institutions as mosque and madrasa, for example, and even new institutions such as religious movements. In the case of Abbasids and Rashida Abbasi, we see cooperation and with the male elite, and we also see how actually female authority played an important role in the training and creation of male religious authority. So I argued in the paper that I tried to show how female authority can be constitutive of male religious authority. And it's interesting that this becomes possible specifically in the Soviet context. So I'll explain this in more detail. And my claim was that contemporary Abbasides is very much a Soviet phenomenon. The second framework, I'd like to begin that female religious authority as a concept is not, of course, new in Islam. We have numerous historical examples of women who excelled in knowledge, in religious knowledge, and who were famous scholars and mystical figures. But their activity was mainly identified to be happening in the female sphere. So that's more a question about the space. In this female sphere and the private space, while public spaces of mosques and madrasas were associated with male religious authority. And my study challenges this framework and suggests that in the conditions of the Soviet Union and its anti-religious propaganda, the public-private divide loses its meaning and its association with particular practices, like, for example, that female education takes place only in the private space. Private space actually becomes even more important for the transmission of religious knowledge, not only among women, but men too. And public spaces are utilized and were utilized by women in more innovative ways. And I'll give you examples from her experience. One more thing that I would like to address here as a sort of a introductory and theoretical point relates to a chronological framework. And the idea is that, and today, if you ask in Russia, who are the Abbasids, many people would tell you that all this institution, the Abbasids, historical figures who were responsible for who were responsible for women's education, who taught girls different types of religious knowledge. And Abastai, the idea is that Abastai is a historical institution which has its roots in the pre-revolutionary period in both northern and southern Central Eurasia. Abastais have been viewed largely by people as traditional institution, and I will address this also, as traditional institution peculiar to the Volga-Ural region, which has been there for a long time. So not exactly sure when, I mean, they don't really address when it started, but has been there for a long time. But regarding the contemporary Abastais, we can say that viewing them as a mere continuation from the pre-Soviet past is not really correct and somewhat anachronistic. Therefore, we need to better understand Soviet Islam in order to see how this contemporary institution is a product of the Soviet realities and of both repression and opportunities that emerged under the Soviet regime. And one last thing in terms of the framework, and that's more a conceptual framework, which deals with the question of compatibility or incompatibility of the Soviet identity and Muslim identity. The Soviet Union was, of course, a state which tried to eradicate any expression of religion, public or private, through eradication of, through repression of religious elites, as, of course, an important element of old loyalties, through defining them as, sometimes through defining them as class enemies, yeah, as kulaks, through deportations, or the anti-religious propaganda, more generally. So how can we make sense of the emergence of such remarkable female religious authority in the Soviet Union? And here, recent studies are helpful as they suggest to view, more generally, to view the coexistence of these two identities, the Soviet identity and the Muslim identity in the post-war period, as not mutually exclusive, but and Muslim identity as surviving only within the repressive Soviet machine, but as actually reinforcing each other. So that's a sort of a novel trend which you would see in a lot of the recent literature. So in other words, these two identities are pretty much, they suggested that these two identities are pretty much compatible with each other, and they even reinforced each other. Okay, so right now I want to talk a little bit about her life and want to illustrate some these points. And if we go back to this picture of the important religious authorities in the post-Soviet Russia, the question, the question is really how do we, so the question is twofold. First of all, how to explain her emergence as religious authority in her own right, and the second is how she is how she's connected to these religious elites beyond just being a family member. And one needs to say that she didn't plan it, of course. But I can suggest that she had a vision, she had a mission to transmit Islamic knowledge throughout her life. Rashida Ishaqi was born into, she was not born into a family of religious scholars as usually Abastais were. So if we think about historical institution of Abastai, usually they were wives of the ulama, wives of religious scholars. And when an imam, for example, in Mahalla was responsible for the education of boy, his wife and Abastai taught the girls. And sometimes, and very often, I think somebody is knocking. If you can admit her. Very often they were born into the families of religious scholars. But Rashida Ishaqi and other Abbasites whom I interviewed were not really born into the scholarly families, and they were not part of the, they were not wives of the religious scholars. So she was born in an ordinary pious family in which her parents, and especially her mom, took conscious effort at transmitting religious knowledge in the environment where the state was getting more repressive in terms of religious institutions. She was born in 1926, and that's a year when we can talk about the beginning of the Soviet assault on Islam. So actually 27, 28, but even 26, there is already a change in the Bolshevik policies towards religion. So this is the time when mosques began to be closed, mullahs were Kulakized, deported to other places of the Soviet Union, or simply perished in the system of terror. And it is in the most difficult years of the 1930s that she was learning the basics of Islam from her mother. And the way, of course, to do this was doing this in secret, covering, for example, windows tightly to get up for suhoor. And I have her recollections here, so I can let you look at it. I won't read it, but I can let you read it on your own for a minute. So this is how she remembers her family and her early childhood, and how they were. And you can see that she was, her parents were very pious, and they were trying to transmit whatever religious knowledge they had. And it's interesting that she would transmit the same attitude towards religion and religious learning to her own children then, in the after-war period, when she would have her own children. First, she instilled in her children a spirit of commitment to perform regular rituals such as prayer, ablutions, and fasting. Second, when her children were growing up, she initiated a madrasa in a shed, or in Tatar, it's a sarai. They call it sarai madrasa, something hardly imaginable in the Soviet period. And she gathered there not only her children and the children of her extended family, but also opened it for other children, the children of her growing circle of pious and observant Muslims. So I'll give you an example of her son's recollection, who was the second mufti of the Republic of Tatarstan. And he recollects here about the years where he and other children studied in that Sarai Madrasa when they were young. And so they lived in the village of Mirny, which is just at the outskirts of the city of Kazan. And that was one of the ways that was possible. So both of them told me that if they lived in the city, that would be much more difficult because, you know, I mean, the apartments are small, but also neighbors are walking around. So the system of denunciations worked pretty well in the Soviet Union, right? So it's interesting how she was teaching not only within her family, but also to a larger community. And then the question that I had was that how would she have that circle of pious Muslims? Because everybody was afraid of talking about religion at the time. First, she did actually two very important things. First, she organized religious classes at her home in the village of Mirny when they moved there to the city of Kazan, and she organized it for adults, for men and women, and she spread information gradually, and her women acquaintances began to join. But it's also interesting that men also began to soon joined too. Some of them were inspired by their wives. Others just learned from the word of mouth. And she taught them how to read the Quran, sort of this basic religious knowledge, how to read the Quran, how to perform the ritual, how to perform namaz, and I mean, this sort of things. Mostly over the weekends, because she was working at a grocery store as a saleswoman, like pretty simple and Soviet work. And it's also interesting that, so for example, I would also like you to read, this was also interesting, to have this Abdullah Galiulin's recollection as a person who was an outsider to her family. So he would eventually marry one of her daughters. I heard that Rashida Abastai was holding, Quranic classes in her, in her house, and one could gain religious knowledge there. And this is the time when he was very young. So that's the end of the 60s and early 70s in her house, and one could gain religious knowledge there. I took classes from her. Then when I wanted to marry, I sought a faithful, pious, and observant Muslim woman. Rashida Abastai's daughters were observant, so I married one of them. And my wife was more knowledgeable than me. I learned a lot about religion from my wife, first from her mother and then from her. So that's a very interesting recollection of his experiences taking Rashida Abastai's classes in the Soviet period. So this is one thing. So she managed to teach her the grown-ups in her house, but then another thing that she did, that she was also utilizing the public spaces, like her workplace at the grocery store, in order to spread knowledge of Islam. It's interesting when I asked her how she did that. And you can look at this, another small piece of recollection, that she would keep the Quran and the Tukai's poetry, and this is one famous poet, Tatar poet, in the store, and then she would talk to people. She would explain them and they would listen. She sometimes asked them something, but usually she would talk, and she would have this sense of she would have an interesting approach. She would try to see if a person was interested, then she would talk more, and if a person wasn't, then she would cite some of the Tukai's poetry, which is, and some of this is very religious. So he would talk about, he wrote about religious poetry. So that's an interesting combination of the way she used the Quran and the Tukai's poetry in a public space. Okay, so and note that these women, the women whom she taught will play an important role in later on at the collapse of the Soviet Union. So when the state authorities learned about these classes, this is also an interesting story. As a result of denunciations, she was summoned by the KGB, and she was prohibited to hold the religious classes. She was threatened to be imprisoned, and said that she wasn't afraid, that there are souls in the prison and she can invite them. But it's interesting that this didn't stop her, and she continued to hold classes in different houses. So they was just starting circulating the houses among the women that she knew. And they did this, disguising the religious classes under the ceremonial ritual of majlis, which is a gathering usually of the family members when somebody passes away. And they gathered this in order to read the Quran for the souls of the deceased people. So there are a number of different occasions for this. Once a person dies, then when 3 days pass, when 7 days passes, when 40 days passes, they used to gather and they used to use these sort of occasions, but also sometimes use them as a pretext in order to hold their religious classes. And actually funerals and the ceremonies associated with the funerals, like were the only ritual which the Soviet state tolerated. And Rashida used them to preach and teach religious knowledge to the Muslims of Kazan. However, she wasn't satisfied because she knew that her knowledge was limited, but she wanted, especially, for her children as they were growing up, especially for her son, to have a higher religious education. And it's interesting that she used other opportunities presented by the state. The Soviet state, of course, was a repressive machine, but starting with 1943, so that's in the middle of World War II, or the Great Patriotic War, when Stalin began to change state religious policies, because he realized that he needed to draw support of the Muslim people of both the Volga-Ural and Central Asia. And he allowed for the opening of a limited number of mosques and official clerics in order to encourage the people's support in the war efforts. And Muftis, for example, announced the war against the Nazi Germany as a holy jihad, as a holy war. Central Asians and Kazakhs, of course, were enrolled in the Red Army, and the remaining people worked in collecting food and working in heavy industry, most of which were moved to Central Asia. And one of the things that Stalin did, and I can show you the picture here, he reopened, and that's right after World War II, he reopened this madrasa to prepare cadres of religious clerics who will cooperate with state authorities and provide a vital link with the Muslim population. And Rashida Bastai, she decided to use this opportunity to provide her son with a higher level of religious education. And when her son came back from the army, she insisted that he goes to study there. Actually, he didn't want to, because he was planning to enroll as a student to study at the engineering faculty. So this is an interesting recollection of him. So he didn't want to, but she insisted, and he agreed. That was sort of an interesting turning point in his life, which she impacted a lot. Later, she would insist that her other son-in-law, Abdullah Goliulin, who was already married to one of her daughters at that time, she insisted that he also enrolls in that madrasa. So he went there, and then he studied in Tashkent, in the Institute of Islamic Institute in Tashkent. One of her other sons-in-law came to study to Miri Arab, to this madrasa from the Crimea. So befriended Rashida's son there, one of her her son, and married one of his sisters later. And then two of her other sons-in-law also went to Bukhara to study in Miri Arab. So it's interesting that the state had its agenda. It has its agenda in establishing the madrasa. But on the other hand, Rashida had her own agenda. She has her own agenda and used this opportunity because this was the only available opportunity to receive higher religious education in the whole Soviet Union. And this, of course, had its impact later on at the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, and this is maybe my last important illustration. I can talk about everything, but then I can answer your question. So finally, not finally, but during the collapse and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which presented a great turn and an opportunity to realize her further goals, Rashida's further goals, she became very actively engaged in the Tatar national movement and religious revival, which was a part or integral into that Tatar national movement. And yeah, so I can show you a couple of very interesting pictures. So this is her giving public address at one of the meetings of the Tatar national movement. And an important thing that this movement was engaged, or some people from this, not everybody, especially her. So she led this campaign at reopening the mosques, the historical mosques that were closed during the Soviet period, and building a little bit later, building new mosques. So this, for example, these pictures would be relating at her activities at opening and building the construction of the new mosques that followed the reopening of the ones that were existed in the imperial time, and then they were reopened. So that was a lot of her activities in the 1990s. But then another interesting thing is that, okay, the mosques, some of the mosques started to be reopening and some of them were constructed but this was not enough for her. So she wanted to, and she did establish the classes for women folk who actually flooded the mosque. So there were many people who were coming to the mosque in the early 1990s. And she opened numerous groups. And what she did is that her students who studied with her secretly in her house or around the house, other houses, during the 70s and 80s, even late 60s, she encouraged them to take each of them one group of women of 15, 20 people and teach them what she had taught them previously. So one of the important things is here that now the men of her family and extended family start occupying important places. So her son opens the Russian Islamic University. He becomes the second mufti. Her sons-in-law each became imams of some important mosques. And one of her sons-in-law became the first mufti of the Republic of Tatarstan that was opened right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So he became imam the first mufti right in 1992. And she, of course, used the sort of legal and institutional power in order to continue that efforts in order to construct new mosques and reopen the old ones. And then she invested her effort and encouraged the women whom she taught previously to become teachers on her own. So when I asked her about students, she said that I have several generations of my students. And that was very interesting to me. So she would say that, oh, that person is a student of my student. And basically she established this, so her authority can be based, or somebody's authority, somebody's religious authority was based on the fact that she was her student. So she studied with her previously. And it's also interesting that this process of the when her students started teaching numerous groups at the mosques, usually during the weekends, but soon also the weekdays, this led to the institutionalization of Abastar in the post-Soviet space. Okay, so I want to stop on this, and I just want to leave some time to your questions. So this is the picture that is taken in the mosque. And this is her recollection about how she forced and actually encouraged women to teach the groups of women, especially in the Marjani, the central mosque. That was the only mosque that remained open during the Soviet period. So, and actually she started doing this even before the collapse of the Soviet Union. But then, of course, all other mosques were closed, and she herself started teaching in the Nurullah Mosque, who was headed by one of her sons-in-law. But let me stop sharing the screen here, and maybe we can have a discussion, or if you have questions, again, I will be glad to answer them.